it was a great movie, but
Yeah.
it seemed like there was resistance to that movie.
Mel Gibson was on the Joe Rogan podcast talking about the sequel to The Passion of the Christ.
Imagine sitting across from one of Hollywood's most fearless filmmakers as he finally opens up about a movie that nearly destroyed his career and the secrets behind it that almost nobody got to hear until now. When Mel Gibson sat down with Joe Rogan, something extraordinary happened. The conversation started casually enough, drifting through filmmaking, faith, and the politics of Hollywood. But then Gibson began peeling back what really went on behind the scenes of The Passion of the Christ, and the room seemed to shift. Rogan, a man who has sat across from presidents, fighters, and whistleblowers, looked genuinely shaken. This wasn't marketing. This wasn't manufactured controversy for clicks. Gibson was lifting a curtain that Hollywood had fought hard to keep shut. And once you understand what he revealed, you may never watch that film the same way again. To understand what Gibson exposed, we have to go back to where it all started. The Passion of the Christ was never meant to be just another biblical epic. Gibson wasn't chasing sweeping cinematography or a safe, predictable retelling. He wanted something raw, something that would grab an audience by the throat and not let go until they truly understood what sacrifice really costs. As he put it to Rogan, the whole point of the film was that all of us bear responsibility, that Christ's sacrifice wasn't just something that happened once in history, but something with weight for every person watching today. He spent years studying the four Gospels, working through every verse describing Jesus' final hours, and he pushed further than most directors would dare, pulling from ancient texts and theological writings to capture not just the events themselves, but everything beneath them. The spiritual battle, the human toll, the divine purpose tucked inside every moment of suffering. The opening scene tells you immediately what kind of film you're about to watch. We're in the Garden of Gethsemane, darkness closing in, Jesus on his knees in prayer while the men closest to him drift off to sleep nearby. The vulnerability is almost unbearable to watch. Here is someone both fully divine and fully human, sweating drops of blood under a weight that seems impossible to carry. Then Satan appears, moving through the shadows, whispering doubt. A serpent surfaces, and Jesus crushes it beneath his heel, a direct echo of Genesis and the very first promise of redemption. Every frame is doing something. Every shadow is intentional. Every line carries theological weight for anyone paying close attention. This was never a film built for casual viewing. Gibson built something that forces you to lean in and wrestle with something much bigger than yourself. During his sit-down with Rogan, Gibson talked about something most people in the industry don't say out loud, something that helps explain why this project ran into such fierce resistance from the start. He'd noticed a pattern, a quiet but very real double standard. Stories drawn from other religious traditions tended to get careful, respectful treatment on screen. But Christian stories were often met with something colder: skepticism, dismissal, sometimes outright hostility. Projects got written off as old-fashioned, too heavy, out of step with modern audiences, built on the assumption that nobody wanted this kind of story anymore. Gibson lived through that resistance firsthand, and it stung. Studios that should have jumped at the chance to back a project from an Oscar-winning director suddenly went quiet. Calls stopped getting returned. Meetings got canceled. People he'd worked alongside for years started keeping their distance. The message was unmistakable. This story wasn't welcome, and neither was he for trying to tell it. It wasn't just doubt about whether the film would sell, there was real pushback against the content itself. But Gibson didn't walk away. His Catholic upbringing meant this was never just a career move, it was personal. When the usual funding sources dried up, he paid for the film himself and built a team of people who believed in the project and weren't scared off by the controversy surrounding it. What came out of that struggle stunned everyone. The Passion of the Christ went on to become one of the highest-grossing R-rated films ever made, proof that audiences were hungry for exactly the kind of bold, unflinching storytelling that executives had insisted nobody wanted. The making of the film was anything but ordinary, and what Gibson described to Rogan moves into territory that's hard to fully explain. Jim Caviezel, who played Jesus, went through real physical suffering on set that no special effect could have faked. The cross he carried weighed over 30 pounds, and during one take it reportedly dislocated his shoulder. During the scourging scene, he was struck by the whips being used hard enough at one point to knock the breath out of him and leave his hands raw and bleeding. That pain wasn't acting, and it shows in every frame of the finished film. Then, according to accounts from the set, there were the lightning strikes. Crew members have described being struck during filming and walking away unharmed, including during the crucifixion scene itself. In biblical tradition, lightning often symbolizes divine power, and its appearance at such pivotal moments left the crew unsettled, caught somewhere between explaining it away and wondering if something beyond ordinary filmmaking was happening around them. The changes weren't only physical either. The actor who played Judas reportedly went into the project as an atheist and came out of it a believer, shaped by months spent living inside themes of betrayal and redemption. The actress who played Mary was said to be pregnant during filming, a quiet, almost poetic thread of life running alongside a story about death and resurrection. Gibson also mentioned reports of unexplained healings connected to the production, including a young girl with severe epilepsy who reportedly went a full month without a seizure after being present on set. Whether these moments were divine intervention, coincidence, or simply the emotional intensity of the experience playing tricks on people's perception, those involved walked away convinced they'd been part of something much bigger than a typical movie shoot. One image in particular captures Gibson's vision perfectly. After the crucifixion, Jesus' body resting in Mary's arms, a clear echo of Michelangelo's Pieta, holding grief and grace in the same frame, devastation and dignity side by side, reaching past religious boundaries into something almost everyone recognizes: love, loss, and hope. When the film finally hit theaters, the response split sharply. Roger Ebert, one of the most influential critics of his era, gave it a full 4 stars and called it among the most violent and intense films he'd ever sat through, saying he hadn't truly grasped the depth of Christ's suffering until watching Gibson's unflinching version of it. Other critics praised its sincerity and ambition, comparing Gibson's direction to the great masters of spiritual cinema. But the controversy came from multiple directions at once. Before release, several religious leaders who reviewed the script raised serious concerns that certain portrayals could echo old, dangerous stereotypes, the kind that had fueled anti-Semitism for centuries. These weren't minor objections. History shows exactly how these narratives have been twisted and used to justify real persecution. Gibson maintained that his goal was to show humanity's shared responsibility for Christ's death. Not to single out any one group, but the debate underscored just how delicate any retelling of this story is bound to be. Scholars also pointed out scenes with no direct basis in Scripture, like Judas being tormented by demonic children. Gibson's answer was simple. This was artistic interpretation meant to express spiritual truth, not a documentary reenactment, using symbolism and visual metaphor to explore guilt, redemption, and spiritual conflict. The film walked a tightrope between historical portrayal and theological reflection, and depending on what a viewer brought into the theater, they walked out with wildly different experiences. Some found it spiritually transformative. Others found it deeply troubling. Almost no one felt neutral, and that intensity only pulled in more attention. People who'd never normally watch a religious film felt compelled to see it and judge for themselves. Churches organized group screenings. Pastors built entire sermons around it. Gibson had made something that simply refused to be ignored. Gibson isn't done with this subject, not even close. During the conversation with Rogan, he revealed that he and screenwriter Randall Wallace have spent 6 to 7 years quietly developing something even bigger, a film about the resurrection, told not as a straightforward narrative, but as a sweeping look at the eternal struggle between good and evil, stretching from the fall of the angels all the way to the death of the last apostle. This isn't a sequel. It's an attempt to go somewhere mainstream cinema has never really gone. Gibson wants to show how that single moment in history connects to everything that came before it and everything that followed, drawing on ancient texts, theological debate, and years of research to get audiences to see a familiar story with fresh eyes. To him, the Gospels aren't myth, they're history, backed by the fact that the apostles who witnessed these events were willing to die rather than deny what they'd seen. As he asked Rogan directly, who dies for something they know is a lie? For Gibson, that question alone is enough to validate the supernatural core of the Christian story. The resurrection remains, for many, the hardest part of the whole faith to accept. Someone executed, buried, and then walking out of a tomb defies everything we understand about how the world works. Gibson admits that for much of his life he simply accepted these claims because the people around him believed them, but over time he went looking for his own answers, and that personal search now shapes everything he creates. He isn't interested in preaching to people who already agree with him. He wants both skeptics and believers to sit with hard questions about existence, meaning, and what happens when life ends. So what was the truth that actually got to Joe Rogan? It wasn't one single moment. It was the weight of everything together, that Gibson stood almost completely alone against an industry that wanted this story buried for good, that strange and unexplainable things happened during filming, that art made with real conviction can change people in ways pure entertainment rarely does, that faith sometimes asks for real suffering, that telling the truth can mean risking everything you've built, and that some stories are worth whatever it costs to tell them. Those truths cut straight through the cynicism we're used to. They reminded Rogan and the millions of people listening that sincerity still exists in a world built on image management, that people still make things for reasons that have nothing to do with profit, and that sometimes the most controversial stories are exactly the ones that need to be told the most. Gibson's whole journey is something increasingly rare, a flat refusal to compromise, to play it safe, or to let industry gatekeepers decide which stories get told and which get quietly buried. The Passion of the Christ doesn't offer easy comfort. It forces you to sit with hard truths about suffering, sacrifice, and redemption, the kind of questions most entertainment is careful to avoid. More than 20 years later, the film still splits opinion right down the middle. Some call it a masterpiece of spiritual filmmaking. Others still see it as deeply flawed. Both sides have a point because great art provokes strong reactions precisely because it touches something we can't easily file away or dismiss. The conversation between Gibson and Rogan pulled back layers most celebrity interviews never even get close to. It showed that behind every controversial work is a very human story of struggle and sacrifice. And it was a reminder that real vulnerability, even from someone as tough and divisive as Gibson, still has the power to move people and open minds. That's the part everyone missed. This was never just a movie. It was one man betting everything on a story the world tried to silence, and somehow, against every odd, winning.